Our next speaker is Jon Benedict. He is a geohydrologist. He's with the Nevada Division of Water Resources, and his topic is perennial yield, Nevada's water rights, line in the sand, some observations on shifting sands and moving line.
So I feel like just saying ditto to Phil's background information. That was great, Phil. I will be just a little bit redundant, but I think it's probably worth providing this Division of Water Resource perspective. I'm a hydrogeologist for the division, and really, as Phil described, for Nevada, perennial yield values have been estimated for all 256 hydrographic areas. And those are based principally on reconnaissance level estimates made by the USGS back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. But I would say that folks familiar with water rights in Nevada recognize that this perennial yield, it represents kind of a line in the sand regarding groundwater availability. And whether a basin's close to additional groundwater use. And it also provides for special management tools, including the designation of critical management areas or even curtailment in hydrologic areas that are over appropriated. And there is evidence that groundwater pumping is causing adverse impacts. So for my presentation, I want to talk briefly about what I would describe as the three main components used to define perennial yield in Nevada, and then focus on some basin-specific examples also in Nevada to illustrate the fact that while perennial yield may be a line in the sand, it is movable, and it really can and should be subject to revisions based on improvements to science and also changes in Nevada's water policy. So this is my view of the three components suggested by our perennial yield definition that each can serve to help define a perennial yield estimate. One, water budget, which Phil described in great detail, I guess, or at least well. And the other, water levels or water level stabilization. And then the third, what I'd call the capturability of water. And each of these components show up in different parts of our definition of perennial yield. The first one, the water budget. So this is the one that the USGS reconnaissance reports and bulletins provided. And these were largely limited to making a first pass estimate of perennial yield based on that water budget estimate. They commonly focused on a hydrographics area discharge component, but occasionally recommended a perennial yield based on the recharge component, particularly in hydrographic areas whose water budget is maybe I'd say complicated by either having no surface water discharge or any kind of surface discharge, including phreatophytes, or by having a through-going river. Now, the water level stabilization is a key metric to ensure that the groundwater system is not being depleted by pumping. These early perennial yield estimates made by the USGS typically didn't directly consider water level data simply because the data were available. But since that time, water level monitoring data collected and maintained by the USGS and also by the Nevada Division of Water Resource have become available, helping to tell a fuller story with respect to water level declines in overpumped basins, and also providing the kind of information needed to help assess areas where perennial yield estimates may be either too high or too low and due for reconsideration. Now, the third component, what I'm calling the capturability of water, is an important one that's not as straightforward as the other two and deserves a little more discussion. So I'd like to read the language in our perennial yield definition here where this component is described, and Phil already did this, but I think it's worth rereading. So the perennial yield is ultimately limited to the maximum amount of natural discharge that can be utilized for beneficial use. So I think it's important to note here that the utilization of natural discharge really is just another way to say that pumping takes the place of or captures that discharge. And I think it's important to recognize that this perennial yield definition appears to recognize the capturability component as the ultimate determinant for perennial yield, suggesting that at the end of the day, only the part of the natural discharge that's actually available for capture and use should be included in perennial yield. So drilling down a little deeper into this capturability of water, it's useful to conceptualize this capturability component in terms of capture curves that are commonly used to describe where water pumped by a well comes from. These same kind of capture curves that describe capture by a pumping well can be applied to the capturability of water from a perennial yield perspective. So if you look on the left, I've got a cross section and the corresponding capture curves for a hypothetical well. So these illustrate that for a pumping well, as it begins its initial pumping, 100% of the water comes from the aquifer storage, as defined by this black line, and results in water level declines that form a cone of depression. With continued pumping, the well's cone of depression expands into areas of natural discharge, including phreatophytes where ET is available for capture, that's evapotranspiration, and also towards surface water features like springs or streams. So continued pumping ultimately increasingly captures these until ultimately the water levels stabilize and 100% of the pumped water comes from capture of the various components of natural discharge. And that's shown here in this curve, right at the very end of the curve, where storage change goes to 0%, evapotranspiration capture and spring and stream capture combined to represent 100% of the total capture, and the system's reached a new equilibrium. So on the right is the exact same plot, just blown up with the same set of curves, but with the labels for those curves changed to reflect what I call an administrative view of perennial yield. So this plot illustrates where there can be portions of captured water like ET that are commonly used to estimate the perennial yield, and other portions of water like previously appropriated springs or streams that are not or should not be considered part of the natural discharge included in the perennial yield. So in this example, that part of the total capture that comes from springs and streams, in other words, this part, which is added to the total, it really represents this amount of total capture above the perennial yield amount, which might be the ET capture, would represent conflict. So the capturability of water component is coming into play more and more as demand on our water resource grows. We learn more about the hydrologic interaction between various source waters of Nevada, and there's a greater need to consider what should and should not be available for groundwater pumping from a conjunctive management perspective. So now I'd like to move on to a few examples that illustrate some of the kinds of revisions to perennial yield that here I'm calling moving lines that have been made in the recent past or are currently being contemplated by our office in specific basins in Nevada. As I go through these examples, you might see how one or more of these three components of perennial yield come into play with respect to how perennial yield estimates are established and then revised in Nevada. So the first example is one I call double counting. This example occurs in the upper part of the Diamond Valley flow system. The area covers four different basins: southern and northern Monitor Valley, here and here, Kobe Valley, and Antelope Valley. So this area is located in central Nevada, just west of the town of Eureka, and these valleys were examined by Rush and Everett of the USGS back in the early 1960s. Now, in that report, Rush and Everett recommended a system-wide perennial yield of 34,000 acre-feet, based on the average of their independent estimates of recharge at 36.4 and discharge, or ET, at 30,400 acre-feet. But they also estimated water budgets for each of the four individual basins separately that included estimates of underflow between the basins. And at the end of the day, Rush and Everett recommended the separate perennial yield values for each individual basin, rather than recommending using a system-wide perennial yield. But in doing so, they included the water moving between the basins as groundwater that's added to the system, even though it's already included in the recharge and ET components for the respective basins. As illustrated here, if the individual perennial yields are totaled up, they add up to substantially more than the system-wide perennial yield of 34,000. So it's just a break in the math. But Rush and Everett recognized this inconsistency, but they recommended this double count under a premise that it was reasonable to allow for the possibility that groundwater development might be more desirable either economically or logistically in one basin at the expense of another. Now, implicit in this scheme was that if one basin developed to a point where it used that interbasin flow, the adjacent basin's perennial yield would need to be reduced. And that's not something that the state engineer always contemplates under those kinds of circumstances. Then, almost 50 years later, in 2011, the state engineer did re-examine and revise the perennial yields for the 4 basins to eliminate that double counting, and they established new and smaller perennial yield values that are equal to only the discharge caused by evapotranspiration in each individual basin. So this example reflects what I call a combination of a shift to a more technically defensible approach, as well as a change in perspective. What at one time seemed reasonable when groundwater was largely undeveloped and considered key to economic development in rural areas has changed. More recent thinking relies on a technically defensible and more conservative approach. So the next example is one from Dayton Valley, and I call this one blurring the line. And this is one that Ed already mentioned. Dayton Valley is located just east of Carson City, and it has the Carson River flowing through it on its way to Lahontan Reservoir. For this hydrographic area, the USGS made estimates of the water budget components, but they didn't specifically recommend a perennial yield value. However, the state engineer used the results from that study to establish a perennial yield of 7,900 acre-feet in 1974. And then later they revised that value in 1984 to 9,445 acre-feet. Now the difference between those two values really was essentially that the 7,900 acre-feet value only included recharge from precipitation, whereas, let's see right there, yeah. Whereas the 9,445 acre-feet value included both that value plus the interbasin flow, the net flow in and out. Now, the reason for this change is not really clear, but it may have simply been a change in the state engineer's perspective on what and shouldn't be included in the perennial yield. Then 25 years later, in 2008, the state engineer revised the perennial yield again, this time noting that the basin recharge should be the measure of perennial yield, that being the precipitation on the basin itself, and that the underflow into Dayton Valley was reserved for the upgradient basin, Eagle Valley in this case. But the most unusual thing the state engineer did here, as Ed had mentioned, was to establish a revised perennial yield having a range between 8,000 and 20,000 acre-feet. That meant to represent the range of uncertainty in basin-wide recharge estimates. So this is a really rare example of a case where the state engineer has accommodated what I'd call uncertainty in the establishment of a perennial yield value. So my last specific example is one I call sharing the line. And this one occurs in part of the Death Valley regional flow system. And it's an example of where a shared perennial yield for 7 separate hydrographic areas has an unanticipated administrative consequence. So these basins were examined back in 1963 by Walker and Eakin of the USGS, who recognized that a substantial amount of flow into the region likely originates from carbonate terrain outside of the immediate area and predominantly to the east. They recommended a perennial yield of 24,000 acre-feet for the entire area based on the system-wide discharge, most of which occurs as ET and spring flow discharge in the southern part of the area, in this area right here. Now, 55 years later, in 2008, concerns about the preservation of the Devil's Hole pupfish resulted in State Engineers Order 1197 that allowed for changes to existing water rights in the Amargosa Desert, but only if their points of diversion were moved further from and resulted in no additional water level decline at Devil's Hole. So in this example, the establishment of a shared perennial yield for multiple individually managed hydrographic areas poses a logistical problem because moving points of diversion further from Devil's Hole is encouraged, but moving points of diversion across established basin boundaries actually violates Nevada water law. So this means that if a water right holder wants to move an existing right from a location that's hydraulically close to Devil's Hole to a more distal location in one of the other 6 hydrographic areas, they couldn't do it, even though doing so is both consistent with this Order 1197 and 1197A, and also with having a shared perennial yield for the entire area. So here the question arises as to whether it'd be better to dissolve the hydrographic area boundary lines and create a single management unit that's more consistent with the shared perennial yield, or would it be better to subdivide the shared perennial yield value among the 7 individual hydrographic areas? As a side note, the USGS has recently published a numerical groundwater flow model for the entire flow system, and our office has issued a new order that's similar in concept to 1197, but establishes this USGS model as our office's tool for evaluating water right applications in Amargosa Desert. And both of these recent occurrences may open up the door to reconsideration of the perennial yield and how we approach that for this region. So in addition to these basin-specific revisions to perennial yield values that I've illustrated, there are other bigger picture issues that I would say justify a more regional or even statewide reevaluation of perennial yield values. Some of these Phil has already mentioned. The uncertainty in perennial yield estimates, as illustrated by the Dayton Valley example, is something that exists on a statewide level. One of the most obvious needs may be to revisit those water budget estimates on a statewide scale using current scientific tools. Certainly, satellite imagery and improved methods for making regional scale estimates of ET can greatly improve the quantification of discharge within any given basin. Also, numerical modeling can help to simulate and quantify how and how much ET and how much stream or spring capture occurs as a result of groundwater pumping, providing a tool to manage and help identify ways to avoid depletion of our groundwater reservoirs, while at the same time optimizing our use of the groundwater resource. Then there's conjunctive management and the recognition of groundwater surface water interactions' role in potential conflict. These also need to be considered in terms of how we estimate and use perennial yield. And finally, what about climate change? Can warming temperatures and more dramatic swings in our weather affect and change our water budgets? And do those need to be considered in our perennial yield? These are all great questions. So with the little bit of time I have left, I want to take a quick look at one of these bigger, again, shifting sand issues, this capturability conflict issue tied to groundwater surface water interactions is highlighted in the Humboldt River region. So for this region, there are 34 hydrographic areas that make up the watershed. And the perennial yield values here are limited to only the groundwater ET component or evapotranspiration component of the water budget. That means that groundwater that discharges to the Humboldt River or ET that has a river source is not included in those perennial yield values. In this region, our office has been focusing on the conflict aspect of the capturability issue. Here, any capture of surface water can result in conflict. And because areas of groundwater ET and locations of hydraulically connected streams occur in the same general areas, it's nearly impossible for pumping to capture just the ET and avoid capturing some of the water from the stream system. So this makes a substantial portion of the ET discharge, otherwise considered available as part of the perennial yield, unavailable due to the potential conflict tied to the side effect of unavoidable stream capture. Indeed, over the past 7 years, our office has been denying new appropriations in the Humboldt River region to capture some amount of stream flow, irrespective of the estimated water availability as indicated by our perennial yield values. So what's the solution here? As an initial step, our office has been granting new groundwater appropriations that would otherwise capture some amount of stream flow, so long as conflict is avoided, by offsetting that capture with a replacement surface water right whose water is actually left in the river. So this means we're solving the problem administratively by using a water right to replace the unacceptable capture from groundwater pumping. But there's an interesting question concerning challenges in terms of administering groundwater rights in this area by perennial yield. And that is, how should groundwater pumping that captures some surface water be accounted for in terms of this administration of groundwater based on a perennial yield? And this is something Phil alluded to. For example, if a well pumps 100 acre-feet but captures 70 acre-feet of water from evapotranspiration and 30 acre-feet from the river, should the full 100 acre-feet of pumping be counted as a committed groundwater appropriation against the perennial yield? Technically speaking, I'd argue that the answer is no, but administratively, and particularly on a statewide basin, right now at least, it may be impossible to split out sources of captured water for all wells in the state when we don't yet have the scientific tools to do so, particularly on a statewide scale. So this example illustrates kind of the tricky question of how to manage water by perennial yield in regions where groundwater and surface water are connected, and each may need to be ultimately accounted for. So with that, in closing, from my position, perennial yield has an important place in Nevada water law that makes it really a powerful tool for managing Nevada's groundwater source. But I'd also like to suggest that establishing and updating estimates of perennial yield based on current science and also an evolving management framework is really key to ensuring groundwater sustainability for Nevada and into the future. So with that, I'll end it.